Welcome to the Cinema Reel. We are gonna be breaking down John Wick 4. The film is packed with a number of different Easter eggs and details, and this scene-by-scene breakdown is gonna be going over it as well as the ending. Now, though you could easily think that this movie picks up right after John Wick 3, there's actually somewhat of a time jump between this film and the last one. Director Chad Stahelski stated in interviews that the movie happens about 8 months after the prior film, and we can see this passage of time in some of the characters and location. Wick fell off the Continental at the end of Chapter 3, but his wounds are now healed, and we see that this is the case with the Bowery King too. The scars he suffered for betraying the High Table have healed up, and New York itself also indicates the passage of time as well. Chapter 1, 2, and 3 happened pretty much back to back, with them all taking place roughly during the spring. New York is covered in snow for this film, and we also know that the Elder has been replaced since the last film. This is an important motif as it shows John that all the members are themselves operating like a Hydra. Sharon Graves seen Hydra: if you get rid of one, then someone else will just come back and fill their place, and he hasn't got enough bullets to take out the entire assassin world. That very much plays into the ending of the movie and his plan to help Kane finally leave the life behind. The pair have a big conversation in a church at one point, and Collider pointed out that this is actually a reference to the John Woo movie The Killer. Centering around a policeman chasing a hitman, we see two people on the opposite sides of the tracks clashing throughout the film. John ended up turning his back on the hitman universe so that he could be with the woman he loved. Kane wished to be with his daughter, and he's sort of a dark mirror of John. In the end, Wick saves him by letting him finally leave the life to be with his loved one, which is a fate that he himself got to experience when he stepped away. This happens during a big duel, and I love how they have to remove their jackets in order to do this, cause as we see, they're bullet sponges. Now, escaping the life enabled John to have a few short years with his wife in which he experienced genuine freedom and happiness. That's all that he wants for Kane too, and it's why he realizes that he has to be smart when taking down the High Table. The entire film is about death and legacy, and though John had the reputation of being a cold-blooded killer, we see in the end how he truly wished to be remembered. His final words are his wife's name, and his gravestone has the phrase "loving husband" embossed into it. He also dies lying back on the stairs, which the Chad stated was a direct reference to one of his favorite animes, Cowboy Bebop. Interestingly, Keanu was also considered to play Spike Spiegel at one point, but we all know how that turned out with Netflix getting the rights to it. When talking about the film, the creative team said that they were inspired by the Hagakure and how one must be accepting of their death just like how John is. The original title for Chapter 4 was gonna be John Wick, Hagakure, but they changed this to being Baba Yaga in some territories. Baba Yaga. We have done a breakdown of the alternate ending for the film, and there were talks that the dog would look over at the graveyard and we'd see John standing looking on. The Bowery King and Winston both say that John is in neither heaven or hell, and this would continue the motif that he managed to escape by faking his death. However, in the end, the team felt like this should be the final chapter, and thus his death is a conclusive one in the end, unless Hollywood back up the truck on Continental coins. Either way, we begin by joining John as he's smashing a post like it's the like button. I remember watching this in IMAX in the cinema, and it was legitimately shaking my entire chair. The Bowery King rattles off a speech, and we hear the words. These are taken directly from Dante's Inferno, which I feel like I mention in every video to the point it's becoming a catchphrase. That's our one Dante's Inferno reference of the video, but it very much acts as a metaphor for the journey that John goes on throughout the film. He travels through the 9 circles of hell, and this story has appeared in the franchise before. If we go back to John Wick 3, Ernest also pulled from the book during the opening scene. There's a ton of biblical imagery, and John of course dies at the end of the movie with the church behind him. The opening scene is actually shot in the sunken Parisian cathedral, La Défense. Throughout the film, John can also seen as the personification of death. In the opening, we watch as he rides on a black horse alongside 3 others, and these represent the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. Kane kills his quote-unquote brother, and no prizes for guessing that this is riffing on Cain and Abel. Lawrence Fishburne and Keanu teaming up again in this franchise of course reunites the pair from the Matrix movies. The behind-the-scenes stuff goes into how this relationship is reflected in the movie. Morpheus acted as somewhat of a guide to Neo as he reached the hidden world and navigated through the underground. That's what the Bowery King does too, and it's something that they referenced in the behind-the-scenes stuff. Now the Bowery King sparks up a match which creates a fire symbolically showing the path of destruction he's about to go on. Beyond that though we follow it with a clear nod to Lawrence of Arabia with the Bowery King blowing out the match. These two jump cuts take us to the desert, and if we're getting super meta we have a character played by an actor named Lawrence referencing a movie about a character called Lawrence. Reach where John ends up at in the desert is also a location they shot at for Lawrence of Arabia, and the Elder's design though traditional, could be a nod to Alec Guinness's as Prince Faisal. Anyway, in both scenes we watch as the sun rises, and this mirrors the ending of the movie in which the sun rises as John passes away. Sunrises metaphorically show the beginning of a new journey, and John is starting one here and then another at the end when he goes on to the next life. The killing starts almost instantly, and according to IMDb, Keanu Reeves gifted each stunt worker with a personalized t-shirt detailing how many times that performer met their demise in the film. His 5-person stunt team also received Rolex Submariner watches, each costing around $10,000, with a personalized message on the back of each one when filming wrapped. Now speaking of jewelry, Wick has returned to get his wedding ring back, and we saw in the prior movie how he had it removed as part of the pact with the High Table. This symbolized that he was married to them and would serve the organization forever instead of finding an attachment to a specific person. A missing finger is something we also see Clancy Brown's Harbinger sporting, and Kane of course gave up his eyes too. Later on with Nobody he admits to doing this, and you might be wondering what he means when he says, "They didn't take them, I gave them," right after Club. Well, I think Kane wanted a way where he didn't think that he'd ever be called back. After all, who would hire a blind hitman? Now John went back on the deal in the climax of 3, and the Elder refuses to end the vendetta. He says, "Only way you will get peace is in death," foreshadowing the end of the film. He kills the Elder, and his return to the surface puts Winston and Sharon in the crosshairs of the Marquis. The hotel is condemned, and an hourglass is placed on the table to mark the countdown. This hourglass was used beautifully in the poster, and we had it being incorporated into Wick's tie with bullets being there instead of sand. With Winston we get a return of Ian McShane, one of many Game of Thrones alumni that appears in the franchise. When discussing how they originally pitched the movie, Chad said that he wanted to go with the idea that they were creating a modern mythology similar to George R.R. Martin's work. The Wick universe has its own currency in the coins, hotels and kingdoms in the Continental, and they even purposely brought over some of the cast to add to that idea. Alfie Allen aka Theon Greyjoy killed John Wick's dog, Natalie Tena shows up later on, Jerome Flynn showed up in part 3, and George Giorgio showed up as the Elder at the start of the movie. The guy who trained Sophia's dogs also trained Ghost, and they have lots of carryovers from the series. Later on Wick also uses a shotgun with incendiary bullets, and this has a cool tie to GOT 2. The weapon's full name is a Turon Tactical Innovations Dracarys Gen 12, with Dracarys of course being what the Targaryens would shout for a dragon to light someone up. Later on we see these shells right after the first radio scene and can catch that they're called Dragon's Breath, with the font even being the same one that's used for Game of Thrones. All we needed was a character saying, "You know nothing John Wick," but these Easter eggs are such a good way to pay off what inspired the franchise. Now when they arrive at the Marquis, Winston tells the story of Ned Kelly's final words. This was an Australian outlaw who shot and killed a policeman after he attempted to arrest his brother. The pair fled and started up a gang that helped them evade the law, similar to the network that Wick has been operating with. Similar to him, they got caught in the end, and the gang ended up being executed as punishment for their crimes. Now though we don't have that happening here, the Marquis is said to be judge, jury and executioner. One thing he also does to set an example is kill Sharon, who's also utters Kelly's final words. Such is life now, I'm sure I don't need to say, but in case you don't know, Lance Reddick sadly died the week before this film's release, making this moment have an extra layer of sadness to it. Lionsgate apparently pulled out all the stops to make sure that the movie was dedicated to him at the end, and even though copies of it had been shipped out to cinemas, they still managed to insert the message. By doing this, the Marquis shows that he's a force to be reckoned with, and throughout the movie he talks about how people must live by the rules. However, he doesn't, and he embodies the mentality, one rule for me and another for thee. The Marquis also represents the upper class, and we actually see him doing something symbolic of this when he stirs his tea. Now I only learned this because of Get Out, and in that you might remember that the mother Missy Armitage does it as part of her hypnosis routine. When I did a breakdown of that, I remember reading a couple of comments talking about how that used to be used in houses when the masters would summon slaves to come and clear the table as they'd show that their food had finished and they were moving on to their tea. I'm not sure if it's exactly why it's been used here, but the marquee controls everyone and its insertion here gets a lot of focus, so yeah, it's going in the video. Now though, it seems like this may be Lance Reddick's final time in the role. We do know that he will be popping up in The Ballerina, starring Ana de Armas. This will take place between John Wick 3 and 4, and it'll also feature a cameo from Keanu Reeves. Later on we see a ballerina performing on stage, which could be a little nod to what's coming down the line. Ana will be playing a character called Rooney, who actually appeared in the third film, being played by Unity Phelan. Anyway, from here we travel to France, namely to Louis XIV's Sun Palace. Known as the Sun King, Louis set this up to mirror Apollo, the sun god who represented peace and tranquility. When we get the establishing shot of Paris, we can see the sun rising over the Eiffel Tower, and the sun rising in Paris again plays into the ending. Kane listens closely to his daughter's playing, and we see that he has a pocket watch that plays a tune from it. This is actually a reference to Mortimer's watch from For a Few Dollars More, and it's not the only reference to the Dollars trilogy. The film of course ends in a duel, and the director stated that this was a direct nod to The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly's ending. The score even lifts a couple of notes from The Ecstasy of Gold, which was the song composed for that seminal scene. Now Donnie Yen once more plays a blind martial artist similar to his role in Rogue One. When he was approached with the role, his character's name was originally Chong, with him being more of a mystic assassin. However, Donnie said that this was too stereotypical and that he wanted to break the mold. Thus he helped to reimagine the character, which brings us to this sunglasses wearing slicked back hair assassin in a suit. I love the way he gets given a card with his next target and he doesn't even read the full name, he just stops when he gets to the end. Such a cool way to show the conflict in him, and we know that he's only going after John in order to protect his daughter. Kane agrees to do the job, and this conversation implies that his blindness was something he had to take on in order to retire. Later on, just before Mr. Nobody goes to meet Marquis, Kane tries to warn him, as he's well aware of just how much the Marquis will twist any deal they try to do. Now this takes us across the globe to the Osaki Continental, which is where we meet Nobody and his emotional support animal. Later on the map in the ransom room we see that this is the Chateau d'Osaka, which is a heavily constructed fortress. Was only on this watch through that I realized that all the dogs after John's puppy survive, and we have had a number of them, including this, Sophia's and John's. Here we meet Akira and her father, the former of which pops up at the end to avenge her dad. At a QA my mate Greg went to, he said that Keanu outright said to Chad that Akira should have killed Kane rather than leaving it open-ended. However, I like the idea that they can either continue one day, or we as an audience can decide the fate of what happened. Either way, my girl Rena kills it in the role, and she actually sings the song in the credits scene titled Eye for an Eye. This obviously speaks to her mentality, and with it being around that vengeance scene, it could spell out where things are going. I love the father and daughter relationship that she and her dad possessed, which echoes the relationship that Kane's trying to get to. Both could have that taken away from them, and the post-credits scene kinda spells out how futile a path of vengeance can be. The saying eye for an eye leads to both people going blind, potentially spelling out that Kane may lose his daughter too. Also eyes, blind, you get the wordplay, mate. However, the blindness should be taken to be symbolic of the character too, as Kane blindly follows the high table whereas the others don't. Now Nobody sits down and looks at his phone, which is when he sees the reward for Wick is at $18 million. This is $4 million up from the last movie, and we see a hint in his notebook to what his plan is. On a double spread page we can catch a list of numbers going all the way up to 50 million. On the right hand side is his dream, which we see valued at being 48.3 million. He's got his dog there, who we know is a girl, and much like Wick and Kane he wants to retire and live with his lady. However, he has to get enough money to do this, and Nobody is constantly waiting until the ransom is racked up to be able to cover the costs of the home. One thing he does is that he also wears his wristwatch on the inside of his arm, which we later see Wick doing when he's at the bottom of the steps. This is actually something that the military do, and it not only stops it from cracking, but it also means that someone can read the time without changing their aim. Anyway, the High Table's forces arrive led by Chitty. There's also armored warriors who are supposed to share similar armor to samurais. If we pause the frame on their masks, you can actually see that they're wearing similar ones to the Japanese demons that used to be common in feudal Japan. They are called Oni masks and they're meant to represent the heads of evil spirits. They're not the only cool nod to the culture that we get either, and there's lots of things in the location that have been purposely picked to reflect the world. Firstly, we see the Osaka Continental soldiers getting bows and swords from fridges, and these are used throughout the battle that ensues. In Japan it's extremely difficult to get guns, and thus these weapons are easier to come by. There's also the fact that the armor worn in the suits is difficult to penetrate. However, sharp objects such as swords and arrows can get through, which we see by an arrow piercing Chidi's wrist. Even goes through a wall too. Blunt weapons can pack a punch too, and we see Wick busting out the nunchucks, which he continues to use throughout the fight after seeing it works to wear people down. I love how Kane uses like doorbell sensors, and there's so many cool moments in these action scenes. It comes to a head with Kane and John facing off against each other, and man even has to hold his breath at one point, so Kane thinks he's dead. Eventually he's saved by nobody, with John returning the favor for his dog later on. Now John hits the underground, and we get a great use of color throughout these scenes in Japan. They very much use the traffic light system in the action, with the scenes where the action stops being filmed with a red light. That happens back at the hotel on the rooftop too, before things change to green once the action kicks off. From here we join nobody meeting the Marquis, and we see as he gets a sort of similar deal to what Kane likely had. A knife is stuck through his hand, and depending on how he gets out of it shows his character. Anyway, back in New York we see Winston visiting Sharon's grave. From Latin the top phrase translates to live is to die, with the bottom translating to my friend. This is something Winston later touches upon, with the first phrase being similar to another that's said throughout the film. Eric Voss also noticed that several of the graves here have names of the crew ONT them. Danny Ravra works in the art department, and Christopher Gilbertson works on the sets. John ends up returning to his Ruska Roma family, and we watch Mr. Nobody flicking through his book. On the left-hand side we the Bowery King symbol, and this actually showed up at the start of the movie during the opening. John is greeted through the name Jardani, and we learned in Parabellum that his full name is Jardani Janovich. He took the latter part of the surname Vich for Wick and has been seen as an outcast in the family. However, there is a way to win his way back, and this sees him going after Scott Adkins' killer. Heavily covered in prosthetics, this is actually a nice little nod to the James Bond franchise. In the Casino Royale book, Le Chiffre was an overweight poker play that puffed on an inhaler, which we see the character doing in his scenes. John is also escorted to him by a guy who just shouts, "I am Klaus," and this was put in the film to reference Groot from Guardians of the Galaxy. Chad Stahelski said that originally they didn't know what lines to give this guy, so they just penciled in "I am Klaus," but upon filming they left it in as a little joke. Klaus is played by Sven Marquardt, who's a real-life Berlin bouncer. His piercings and tattoos have helped him to gain a lot of attention, and he's one of the most famous bouncers in Europe. He works at a techno nightclub, which is where we go next for the big scene. Now Killer calls Wick the Baba Yaga, and he also shows him the ace of spades when shuffling the deck. This is the card that has a lot of meaning to it, and the card used to be associated with death and destruction. Now Kane comes forth and he sips on a teacup, which also looks similar to the one that the Marquis stirred at the start. This symbolically shows they're in the same boat mentally as each other, and they're then joined by Mr. Nobody. Delta Deadman's hand. This acts as obvious foreshadowing for what's to come, but Wick uses the hand with his hand to turn Killer into a dead man. FK, that's a reach. However, its name is pretty interesting, and this derives from the story of Wild Bill Hickok. Hickok was shot dead during a poker match, and at the time his body was holding this hand. I think that the creative team purposely pull from legends like this any time they can, because it helps keep up the tone of this universe. When it kicks off, I love how Kane throws a flashbang and it stuns a group of men, but he's completely unaffected due to his blindness. It leads to a club scene reminiscent of the one from the first and second movie. This is reflected in the music too, with the DJ here being Luke Castlevania, whose music they used during that club scene in the first film. The song we hear for this scene here comes from that second film, and it's titled John Wick Mode. Little tangent here, yeah. But when I was growing up I used to think every club used to have rain coming down on people whilst they all danced in slow motion like this. In actuality most of them are S-tholes, and you can catch your mate John getting his wick wet from the rain outside. Could have went worse there, but we kept it PG. Anyway, it's a big overblown fight, and I think what they do perfectly in this film is that they pull together lots of different elements for this final film. Over the years the creative team have clearly learned lots of different techniques and have obviously scouted several environments that they think will make major action scenes. So we have big things like the classic club scene, the dog tearing people up like it did with Sophia's in 3, muscle cars smacking about, and yeah, it's just kinda them employing everything they've learned. After collecting killer's teeth, John is brought back into the family through branding himself along with his surrogate sister Katia. Elsewhere we join Winston meeting back up with the Marquis. The pair look over the painting of Liberty leading the people, which has a lot of deep symbolism connected to the movie. This painting depicts how when people are united that they can overcome oppression, much like how John manages to overcome the high table. The next painting we get focus on is the Raft of Medusa, which is said to depict every emotion that a human is capable of having in any given situation. Wick has really been through the ringer, and this could represent all the different emotions that he's faced along the way. Lastly, as the Marquis stands up and looks at Liberty leading the people, we see another big painting on the wall behind him. This is actually the death of Sardanapalus, which has a lot of ties to the Marquis himself. Now to give some context to it, Sardanapalus was a king who had 100 prisoners of war executed. The Marquis has been carrying out executions as well, but it goes far beyond that. In the painting we can catch Sardanapalus wearing all white as he lounges about watching the chaos around him, and he looks completely disinterested. He's wearing all white and has a golden pitcher beside him which is reflected in the Marquis. The world is crumbling below him, but the villain is happy to lounge about in his art gallery, and he even has a golden coffee machine stationed there with him. This instantly foreshadows the fate of the Marquis, and it lets us know that he's gonna die come the end of the film. I love how Liberty leading the people is placed on the opposite side facing this, so we have the rich elite on one whilst John's represented on the other. Gives this idea that these two sides are facing one another, and after he's taunted he agrees to the duel. Winston is told that if John fails that he'll be executed too, and we get him saying, "Such is life." Before the Eiffel Tower we see Wick going through another card game that will decide his fate. Wick wants to do it there and then, and he calls the time to have the duel as being now, but unfortunately the Marquis wins, and thus it gets set to sunrise. I love the little choices John makes here, and he clearly wants to handle things instantly, but the Marquis fires back by explaining that even if John wins that he'll never leave the life. The Marquis says that this is what he is and all that his life is as well. He rattles off about how John was plucked from the streets by the organization as an orphan, and he belittles the life he's led and all his accomplishments. There is no John out there, no happy husband. However, in the end John decides to be remembered as a loving husband, and all that come and visit his grave will see that that's how he chose to be remembered. Interestingly, the Bowery King says he wants us to say "Long live the king," and this was also the phrase he said in 3 just before he thought he was going to die. This is reflected in the church scene with Wick lighting up a candle wick in memory of his wife. He doesn't think that she can hear him, but he does it. From here we cut to the Marquis, who's faced with a dilemma. If he loses then he dies, and if he kills Wick then Wick becomes a martyr that leads the people. Take sanctuary in an underground station, this known as Port des Lilas. Often appearing in films, the station has a disused platform that's upkept for filmmakers so that the platform can be rented out for them. It also means that they don't have to close the station to film there, and it's been used in a lot of TV shows and movies. Over the top of this we hear the song Les Amants du Dimanche, which translates to mean lovers for a day. It's difficult to get an English translation for the lyrics here, but it talks about a short-lived romance and being unable to forget this. If I'm right with that, then I think it's been chosen to represent John's marriage, but let me know in the comments below if I'm off. I'll even let you call me a chump. Helped by the Bowery King and Winston, we watch as John makes his way across Paris whilst every hitman in the city descends on him. This is put out in a call from the Eiffel Tower itself during a radio scene inspired by the Warriors. The moments are almost identical, with us get a shot of the woman's lips as she announces the hit through using code. We also get an updated version of the song Nowhere to Run, which too was played in that film whilst the Warriors made their way back home. Wick is described as the man in black, and it too influences the soundtrack, with us getting painted black when it all kicks off. He of course wears a black suit, has black hair, a black tie, black waistcoat, and later on he drives a black car. This leads to him once more carrying on the idea he's the personification of death, or the Baba Yaga. Taking things to the Arc de Triomphe, we also saw a similar scene in Mission Impossible Fallout with both Ethan and John driving the wrong way round on it. Bloody Americans. What do you mean he's Canadian? This car is missing the doors, with it being a similar thing to what happened during the opening of the second film. Further ties to that movie include it being mentioned that the Tarasovs are after an audience with the High Table, and this is the family Wick wiped out in 1 and then made a truce with in 2. They could be wanting to form an alliance, but I'd like to think that they just want to warn them to leave Wick alone. And we see why in the next scene, with us getting what's probably the most memorable action scene in the entire franchise. In an overhead one take we watch as he works his way through a disused building whilst nobody stalks him to up the ransom. When the movie dropped, a lot of people were talking about which game might have inspired this, but Chad Stahelski cleared things up and said that it was the 2019 game Hong Kong Massacre. Haven't played it, but obviously this is a genre that has deep roots in gaming, with it being used as a style on lots of different titles. They perfectly recapture it here, leading to one of the best action scenes from the last 10 years. Saving nobody's dog, he sort of redeems the dog he couldn't save himself. They did something similar with Andrew and MJ in No Way Home, and it allows the character to right a wrong from the past. We cut across town to see Kane outside the Moulin Rouge, and he ends up putting a pencil in his pocket which he later uses on Chitty. Wick has been known as a man who can kill people with a keen pencil, and Kane using this as a weapon could show he's stepping into the role in the franchise. He of course wanted to get out of it much like Wick, and he was also used as assassin by the High Table. Before that though, we have to get the big stair scene, and huge shoutouts to Sarah Flores for pointing out the deeper meaning in this. The scene here has parallels with the story of Sisyphus, who was tortured by Hades for tricking death twice. This is something John himself has done as well, and the myths say that the punishment must be severe for doing this. Sisyphus was told that he had to roll a boulder up a hill every day, and every time he made it to the top it then rolled back down again. This is reflected in John finally making it to the top only to get pushed right back down again. It's such a crazy scene, and we feel a lot like Wick, with us being mentally exhausted by the onslaught we've just sat through. But John still has his allies, and using a cane he's able to get to the top. Might be a walking pun that, but it leads to the duel between the two, with some great lines of dialogue. FK off in the end, Wick wins because he knows that the Marquis is so arrogant that he'll want to be the one that delivers the killing blow. By getting to a point where he swaps out with Kane, John is able to lure him in by using himself as bait, and he kills the character, finally freeing himself and Kane. Kane calls him his brother, possibly showing a reverse of the Cain and Abel story, with there being an alternate outcome. John dies on the steps after saying his wife's name, summing up what his life was really about. Cut to the graveyard to see him laid to rest side by side with her gravestone after he asked to be taken home. John Wick is no more, but the friends and people he helped save will live on. Potentially, Kane is gonna be going head to head with Akira, but that's a film for another day. Anyway, that closes out the movie, and I hope you enjoyed John Wick 4.